Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at excerpts from Seven Deadly Sins, The Biology of Being Human. It's by Guy Leschner.
Oh yeah, it's a fascinating read. It takes a very scientific approach to these age-old concepts of sin.
Yeah, we're going to be specifically looking at wrath and gluttony, but not in the traditional sense, right? We're really going to dive deep into the biological and the neurological underpinnings of these behaviors.
Exactly, yeah. Listiner uses case studies, scientific research, even evolutionary perspectives to kind of illustrate how these sins are actually deeply rooted in our biology, in our human biology.
And I think before we get started, it's worth mentioning the author's personal connection to this. He talks about his grandfather's experience with the horrors of Nazi Germany, which,
Oh.
really adds another layer to this whole, exploration of sin.
It does. It definitely sets the stage for a more nuanced and thought-provoking discussion about human behavior for sure.
Okay, so let's start with wrath. I guess the first question is, what exactly is wrath? Is it always a bad thing?
Well, Les Sinners dives into some compelling cases that really highlight the spectrum of wrath. Um, we meet Sean, a man whose seizures trigger uncontrollable rage and violence.
Wow, that sounds incredibly scary. It must be very difficult for him and those around him.
Absolutely. And what makes this case even more fascinating is that Sean is described as a peaceful person outside of these episodes.
Hmm. So what's going on there? If he's normally peaceful, what's causing these outbursts?
Well, it turns out that Sean's aggression is a result of what's called a post-ictal state. It's essentially the lingering effect of a seizure that leaves his brain in this disrupted state.
So it's like his brain is basically short-circuiting and he's not really in control of his actions.
That's a good way to put it. And then we have Jono, who experiences something called Keppra rage,
Hmm.
which is a side effect of his anti-epileptic medication.
So once again, something biological, seizures in one case, medication in another, is profoundly impacting behavior. What does that tell us about the underlying causes of anger, just like in general?
Well, it suggests that anger isn't just a matter of choice or willpower. There are specific areas of the brain involved, and one key player is the amygdala.
The amygdala, now, isn't that the part of the brain associated with fear? What does that have to do with anger?
That's right. The amygdala is involved in processing threats and triggering the fight or flight response. And anger is often a reaction to a perceived threat, even if that threat isn't real.
I see the connection. Now, the book also mentions the prefrontal cortex. What's its role?
Well, the prefrontal cortex is crucial because it acts as a sort of braking system on the anger response. It helps us regulate and control our impulses.
So if the amygdala is the gas pedal, the prefrontal cortex is the brake.
A perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And this interplay between these two areas is highlighted in the famous case of Phineas Gage, the railroad worker who had that horrific accident.
Oh, the one where the tamping iron went through his skull?
Yes, it severely damaged his frontal lobe and completely changed his personality. He became impulsive, aggressive, and had difficulty controlling his emotions.
So damage to the prefrontal cortex can essentially unleash unrestrained anger.
Precisely. Now, it's important to distinguish between anger, which is the emotion, and aggression, which is the behavior. And the book points out that aggression is a major cause of death and injury worldwide.
It really makes you think about the impact these strong emotions can have.
Absolutely. And it's not just about brain regions. Lovechner also explores the role of hormones like testosterone.
I can see how that might play a role, but isn't it a bit of a stereotype to say that testosterone equals aggression?
There's definitely more to the story than that. While men may be more prone to physical aggression, women exhibit aggression in other ways, like verbal aggression or indirect aggression, which is more about social manipulation.
So aggression isn't just about like punching walls or getting into fights. It can be much more subtle.
Exactly. And the book also delves into how childhood experiences and trauma can have a lasting impact on how we process and express anger.
That makes a lot of sense, right? If someone grows up in a volatile or a dangerous environment, they might be more likely to perceive threats and react with anger.
Precisely. Leschner talks about borderline personality disorder, BPD, which is often characterized by intense anger and difficulty controlling emotions. And BPD is often linked to childhood neglect or abuse.
Mm. So it sounds like these early experiences can actually change the structure of the brain, particularly in the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, which can make someone more susceptible to anger and aggression.
You're exactly right. It's like the
Mm.
brain becomes wired for a higher threat response based on those early traumas.
Wow. Then we have the case of Tom, who experienced a dramatic personality shift after suffering a brain hemorrhage. The book mentions he was a musician, right?
Yeah, Khan was a successful sound engineer and session musician. He described himself as driven and competent, but admitted that, he could be a bit of an arsehole sometimes.
And what happened after the hemorrhage?
Well, he became prone to sudden fits of rage, which was a stark contrast
Mhm.
to his pre-hemorrhage personality.
It's incredible how a physical event in the brain can trigger such drastic behavioral changes. Do we know what part of his brain was damaged?
It's likely that Tom's hemorrhage affected his frontal lobes, which, as we discussed, play a crucial role in inhibiting impulsive behaviors.
So, like with Phineas Gage, his internal brake pedal was damaged.
Exactly. And while Tom's case was caused by a physical injury rather than medication, there are definite parallels to Jono's Kepler rage. Both illustrate how disrupting that delicate balance of brain function can unleash anger and aggression.
These stories are so powerful because they really challenge our assumptions about anger and control. If someone's brain is literally wired differently, can we really hold them fully responsible for their actions?
That's a huge question and one that the book grapples with throughout. But before we dive into the complexities of free will, let's shift gears and explore the second sin on our list.
Gluttony. Our gluttony. It's interesting because when we think of gluttony, we often think of overeating, but is that all it is?
It's definitely a common association. But gluttony, at its core, is about excessive desire for something. And in this case, we're focusing on food. But the book highlights how this desire can be driven by biological factors that are beyond our conscious control.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Can you give me an example of what you mean by biological factors?
Sure, Lessiner introduces us to James, a morbidly obese man who struggles to control his food intake, even on a normal hospital diet. It wasn't simply a matter of willpower or discipline. His case suggests there's something more going on at a biological level.
So you're saying his body is driving him to eat more than he needs.
That's one interpretation. And then we have the story of Alex, a young woman with Prader-Willi syndrome, or PWS.
I've heard of PWS. It's a genetic disorder that causes insatiable hunger, right?
Exactly. Imagine constantly feeling ravenous, never feeling full, no matter how much you eat. That's the reality for people with PWS.
Oh, wow. It sounds incredibly challenging for both Alex and her family.
Absolutely. The book describes their heart-wrenching struggles to manage her constant need to eat, and it delves into the science behind this insatiable hunger, specifically the role of the hormone leptin.
Leptin, doesn't that have something to do with regulating appetite?
Yes, leptin acts as a signal to the brain, letting it know when the body has enough energy stored. You think the brain is having a hunger thermostat. Leptin is one of the key messengers that tells the brain to turn the heat down when we've had enough to eat.
Okay, that makes sense. But in people with PWS, is there a problem with leptin production?
In some cases, yes, but PWS is a complex disorder, and there are multiple genetic mutations that can disrupt the appetite regulation system.
So this is where it gets a little complicated for me. So we have these specific cases like James and Alex, but how does this relate to the broader science of appetite and weight regulation in the general population?
Well, Alex's case with PWS helps us understand the concept of this hunger thermostat in the hypothalamus, a part of brain that plays a crucial role in regulating many bodily functions, including appetite.
Okay, so our brains are constantly monitoring our energy levels and sending signals to eat when we need to refuel. But if this system is supposed to be so finely tuned, why are so many people struggling with obesity?
That's the million-dollar question. And the book presents some intriguing theories. One is the maladaptation hypothesis, which suggests that certain genes that helped our ancestors survive in cold environments are now working against us in modern society.
Wait, what? Cold climates and obesity? How are those connected?
Imagine you're living in a place where food is scarce and the winters are harsh.
Hmm.
You need to be able to store energy efficiently to survive. So your body evolves to hold onto fat and burn calories slowly.
That makes sense in that context, but how does that relate to obesity today?
Well, in today's world, we have an abundance of readily available food, and we live in temperature-controlled environments. Our bodies haven't quite caught up to this drastic change. Those once beneficial genes are now contributing to weight gain.
So our bodies are stuck in survival mode, even though we don't need to store energy like we used to. Our genes are basically fighting against us in today's environment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating example of how our evolutionary past can have unintended consequences in the present.
Wow, that really puts things in perspective. Okay, back to PWS for a moment. You mentioned it's a complex genetic disorder. Can you break it down a bit more for me?
Sure, one of the key things to understand about PWS is the concept of imprinting. Essentially means that some genes are only expressed if they are inherited from a specific parent. In PWS, the crucial genes related to appetite control are often silenced, leading to problems with how the brain regulates hunger.
So it's like having a faulty hunger switch that can't be turned off because the instructions for building that switch are missing or incomplete.
That's a good way to visualize it. This imprinting process plays a crucial role in the development of PWS and its characteristic insatiable hunger.
This is also fascinating, and speaking of fascinating, the book also delves into the world of gut microbiota and its influence on weight gain. It's like we have trillions of tiny tenants living in our gut, and they might be playing a role in how our bodies process food.
That's right. This area of research is exploding, and we're learning more and more about how gut bacteria impact our overall health, including weight regulation. The book even mentions fecal matter transplantation, or FMT, being used to treat various conditions.
FMT, you mean poop transplants?
As strange as it sounds, yes, it's a real medical procedure. And studies have shown that transferring gut bacteria from obese mice to lean mice can cause the lean mice to gain weight.
So the bacteria themselves could be contributing to weight gain.
It seems so.
Yeah.
We're still in the early stages of understanding that complex interplay between gut bacteria and obesity,
Yeah.
but the research is incredibly intriguing.
It's like we're discovering a whole new world inside our bodies. And there was another concept in the gluttony section that caught my attention. Epigenetics. Can you remind me what epigenetics is all about?
Sure. Epigenetics is essentially the study of how our environment can change the way our genes are expressed without altering the DNA sequence itself. Think of it like this. Your genes are the hardware, and epigenetics is the software that controls how that hardware operates.
Okay, I'm with you. So how does epigenetics relate to gluttony?
The book discusses a compelling study called the Dutch Hunger Winter Study. During World War II, there was a severe famine in the Netherlands. What researchers discovered was that children conceived or born during this famine had a higher risk of developing obesity and other health problems later in life.
Wait, so even though they experienced starvation in the womb, they were more likely to become obese as adults. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it highlights the powerful influence of epigenetics.
Yeah.
It's like their genes were programmed for scarcity, even though they ended up living in a world of abundance.
That's an incredible example of how experiences in the womb can have long-lasting consequences. And it also raises questions about personal responsibility when it comes to health and weight management. If our genes are being influenced by factors beyond our control, how much agency do we really have?
It's a really complex question, and speaking of complex, the last aspect of gluttony I want to touch on is the neural circuitry of pleasure and reward.
Ah, yes. This is where dopamine takes center stage.
Absolutely. Dopamine is a key neurotransmitter in the reward pathway, which is all about driving us towards pleasurable experiences. And eating tasty food definitely falls into that category.
So we're hardwired to seek out pleasurable foods.
In a way, yes. From an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense. But in today's world where we're surrounded by hyper-palatable foods that are engineered to trigger massive dopamine release, this can lead to overeating.
That explains why I can never resist those chocolate chip cookies.
Well, it's not just dopamine. The book also talks about endogenous opioids, which are the brain's natural painkillers.
Opioids and food. What's the connection?
It might seem strange, but opioids actually contribute to the pleasurable feelings associated with eating, particularly when it comes to sugar.
So sugar is kind of like our own personal drug.
In a way, yes. It triggers the release of opioids, which creates feelings of satisfaction and well-being. And this can lead to a cycle of craving and consumption, just like with other addictive substances.
That explains a lot. It sounds like we're programmed to seek out pleasure, but in today's world, that programming can backfire and lead to unhealthy behaviors like overeating.
That's a great summary, and it brings us right back to that question of free will. If our brains are driving us towards these pleasurable experiences, how much control do we really have?
It's definitely something I wrestle with. On the one hand, I believe in personal responsibility. But on the other hand, it's clear that our biology plays a huge role in shaping our behavior.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. But by understanding the science behind these sins, we can start to have more compassion for ourselves and others who are struggling.
I couldn't agree more. Before we move on, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question.
Go for it.
If gluttony is rooted in our biology and we're essentially wired to seek out pleasure, what does that mean for our understanding of personal responsibility and free will when it comes to eating and weight management? Is it even possible to overcome our biological programming?
That's an excellent question, and one that we'll continue to explore in part 2 of this deep dives. Welcome back to our deep dive into the biological underpinnings of wrath and gluttony. We've been unpacking some fascinating research that really challenges our traditional views on these so-called sins.
It's been quite a journey so far. We've explored how our brains and our bodies can contribute to behaviors that are often seen as, negative or even immoral.
Yeah, and now we're going to layer in the evolutionary perspective on wrath. It's intriguing to consider why anger and aggression would have been advantageous from an evolutionary standpoint.
Right. At first glance, it seems kind of counterintuitive, but I'm sure there's a good explanation.
There is anger and aggression, in the right context, played a crucial role in human survival. Think about our early ancestors, right? Being able to fight off predators, rivals, would have been essential for, survival.
That makes sense, but wouldn't that mean that we're all just inherently aggressive creatures?
Not necessarily. The book introduces this idea that humans might have a low predisposition to reactive aggression, but a high capacity for proactive aggression.
Hold on, I need you to break that down for me. What's the difference between reactive and proactive aggression?
Okay, so reactive aggression is impulsive, like lashing out in the heat of the moment when you feel threatened or provoked. Proactive aggression, on the other hand, is planned and calculated. It's about achieving a specific goal, whether it's conquering new territory, securing resources, or even climbing the social ladder.
So reactive aggression is like road rage, while proactive aggression is more like a military strategy.
Those are great examples. And the book suggests that humans have evolved to favor proactive aggression over reactive aggression. Planning and strategizing would have given our ancestors a huge advantage when it came to surviving and thriving.
So we're not just mindless aggressors, but we do have that capacity for violence when it serves a purpose.
Exactly. And to further understand the evolution of aggression, Lessiner compares human aggression to that of our closest primate relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos.
Ooh, that's a fascinating comparison. Chimpanzees are known to be quite aggressive, aren't they?
They are. Chimpanzees have high levels of both reactive and proactive aggression. They're often vying for dominance and resources, which can lead to conflict.
And what about bonobos? Aren't they supposed to be the peaceful primates?
Yes, bonobos are known for their relatively peaceful nature. They have lower levels of reactive aggression and rarely engage in proactive aggression. They're much more likely to resolve conflicts through social bonding and, well, sexual activity.
That's quite a contrast. So where do humans fall on the spectrum between chimps and bonobos?
Well, we seem to be somewhere in between. We have the capacity for both peace and violence. And the way we express aggression is shaped by a complex interplay of biological and social factors.
This brings to mind the idea of nature versus nurture.
Right.
We have these biological predispositions, but our environment and experiences also play a huge role in shaping our behavior.
You've hit the nail on the head. And he also introduces an interesting theory called the self-domestication hypothesis to explain how humans may have evolved to become more cooperative and less reactively aggressive.
Self-domestication, does that mean we've, tamed ourselves over time?
In a sense, yes. The idea is that as humans evolved, we began to favor cooperation and reduce reactive aggression because it was beneficial for the survival of the group.
That makes sense. Cooperation would have allowed for more complex social structures, division of labor, sharing of resources, which would have given groups, a significant advantage.
Precisely. And this self-domestication is thought to have been a crucial factor in the development of human societies as we know them today.
It's incredible to think about how these evolutionary pressures shaped not only our physical traits, but also our behavior and our social structures. It really highlights the interconnectedness of biology, behavior, and culture.
Absolutely. And to kind of wrap up this section on wrath, the book touched on the topic of psychopathy, which is a personality disorder characterized by a lack of empathy and remorse, and a high propensity for proactive aggression.
It's almost like psychopathy represents the extreme end of the aggression spectrum.
You could say that, and while the causes of psychopathy are complex and multifaceted, Lessner emphasizes that interplay of both genetic and environmental factors.
So even our darkest impulses can be traced back to our biology. It's a bit unsettling, but also fascinating. It makes you realize that even behaviors that we deem unacceptable or evil have a biological basis.
It certainly challenges our simplistic notions of good and evil, and that's something that the author emphasizes throughout the book. These 7 deadly sins are not simply matters of choice or morality. They're deeply rooted in our biology. shaped by genetics, brain function, environmental influences, and millions of years of evolution.
It's a humbling realization, isn't it?
It is, and it invites us to view these behaviors through a more nuanced and compassionate lens. Just as our biology can predispose us to certain behaviors, it can also limit our control over them. In some cases, it doesn't excuse harmful actions, but it does encourage us to consider, the underlying factors at play.
That's a powerful message. And speaking of powerful, let's revisit the topic of gluttony and delve into the biological factors that can drive our desire for food.
All right, let's dive back into the world of appetite and satiety.
Yeah.
We were discussing how our brains and our bodies work together to regulate how much we eat.
Right. And we were talking about how that system can go awry, leading to conditions like obesity or Prader-Willi syndrome.
Exactly. And to really understand the complexities of gluttony, it's helpful to understand the brain's reward system and the role that dopamine plays in driving us towards those pleasurable experiences, including eating.
Now, dopamine is often referred to as the feel-good chemical, and I can see how it would be involved in our enjoyment of food.
It's absolutely crucial. When we eat something delicious, dopamine is released in the brain, reinforcing the behavior and making us want to eat more of it. This is a survival mechanism that ensured our ancestors sought out calorie-rich foods when they were available.
So it's like we're programmed to seek out pleasurable foods.
Yes, but the problem is that in today's world, we're surrounded by hyper-palatable foods that are engineered to trigger massive dopamine release. These foods hijack our reward system, making it harder to resist overeating.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just a matter of willpower. Our brains are literally being manipulated by the food industry.
That's a good way to put it. And it's not just dopamine that's at play. The book also talks about endogenous opioids, which are the brain's natural painkillers.
Opioids and food, what's the connection?
It might seem strange, but opioids actually contribute to the pleasurable feelings we experience when we eat, particularly when it comes to sugary foods.
So sugar is like our own personal drug. It triggers those feel-good chemicals in our brains.
You got it. And just like with other addictive substances, this can lead to a cycle of craving and consumption. We eat sugary foods, experience a rush of pleasure, and then crave more to keep those good feelings going.
This is all making me think about how addictive certain foods can be. I know I've definitely experienced, intense cravings for things like chocolate or potato chips.
It's incredibly common, and it speaks to the power of the reward system. These foods hijack our brains, natural reward pathways, making them very difficult to resist.
So it's not just a matter of being weak-willed or lacking discipline. There's a real biological basis for these cravings.
Exactly, and understanding that can help us approach these issues with more compassion and less judgment. It's not about blaming ourselves or others for struggling with food. It's about recognizing the powerful biological forces at play and developing strategies to navigate them effectively.
This whole discussion is really shifting my perspective on gluttony. It's not simply about overindulgence or lack of self-control. It's about understanding how our brains and our bodies are wired to respond to food, especially in today's environment.
I'm glad to hear that. And that brings us back to that central question we've been circling around.
Hmm.
If our biology is so influential in shaping our behavior, what did that mean for our concept of free will? Do we have any agency in our choices? Or are we just puppets of our genes and our neurochemicals?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that we'll be tackling in the final part of our deep dive.
We'll delve into the author's thoughts on free will and explore what these biological insights mean for our understanding of morality and responsibility.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been exploring the biological underpinnings of wrath and gluttony, and now we're diving into the deep end. The question of free will.
Yeah, it's the age-old debate.
Yeah.
Are we truly in control of our choices, or are our actions predetermined by, our biology and our experiences?
Right. We've seen how brain chemistry, genetics, even evolution can influence our behavior.
Yeah.
So where does that leave free will?
Well, Lichtensteiner tackles this head-on in Seven Deadly Sins. He doesn't shy away from the tough questions even diving into thought-provoking research like the Libet experiment.
Oh, I'm not familiar with the Libet experiment. Can you give me the rundown?
Of course. Benjamin Libet was a neuroscientist who conducted these fascinating experiments in the 1980s. He wanted to understand the timing of conscious decisions.
Okay, so how did it work?
Participants were asked to perform a simple action like flexing their wrist whenever they felt like it. But here's the twist. They were also hooked up to an EEG, monitoring their brain activity.
Interesting. So what did they discover?
Something really interesting. Libet found a burst of brain activity called the readiness potential, about half a second before participants consciously decided to move their wrist.
So their brains were preparing for the action before they even knew they were going to do it.
That's the key finding. And some people interpret this as evidence that free will is an illusion. Our conscious decisions might actually be predetermined by unconscious brain processes.
Wow, that's mind-blowing. But I imagine there are other ways to interpret these findings.
There are. The Libet experiment has been debated for decades. Many neuroscientists and philosophers argue that it doesn't actually disprove free will. It raises more questions than it answers.
So where does Leshner land on this debate? Does he think we have free will or not?
Well, he acknowledges the complexities of the issue and doesn't take a firm stance, but he makes a really important point, regardless of whether free will is real or an illusion.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the point?
Yeah. Even if free will is an illusion, even if our biology heavily shapes our choices, we still have a responsibility to understand ourselves and try to control our behavior.
So it's not about blame or punishment. It's about self-awareness and making an effort to manage our tendencies.
Exactly. Think about it. If someone has a brain tumor causing aggressive behavior, we don't hold them, morally responsible. It's not their fault.
Right, they're not in control.
And even if we don't have total free will, even if biology is pushing and pulling us, we still have a responsibility to try to understand those influences and make conscious choices that are aligned with our values.
So this applies to wrath and gluttony too.
Absolutely. We can't just excuse our anger or our overeating by saying, oh, it was my biology.
Hmm.
We have to take responsibility, even if those actions are influenced by factors outside our conscious control.
That's a really nuanced perspective. It's like we're not puppets controlled by our biology, but we're also not completely free agents either.
It's a delicate balance. And by understanding that balance, we can start to live more meaningful and fulfilling lives.
I love that. It's empowering even though it acknowledges the complexities. So to wrap up this incredible deep dive, what's the one big takeaway you want listeners to remember?
I think the most important message is that we are all incredibly complex beings, shaped by both our biology and our experiences. And by understanding the science behind these so-called deadly sins, we can start to view ourselves and others with more compassion and understanding.
Beautiful said. This is just the beginning of the exploration, though. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
That's what it's all about.